me.
Ah. And what would you expect?
Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is flow as a self-expansiveness phenomenon.
Michael.
Oh, sorry. Okay. What we're going to be talking about today is flow as a self-expansiveness phenomenon. Now, the research I've done is it's in its nascent stages, so it's really baby research. So before we get into flow, I just want to talk a little bit about a specific branch of psychology that deals with flow, which is positive psychology in this case. Now, positive psychology, as most of you may know, is a relatively recent branch of psychology. So it was invented in 2000 by Martin Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi. So what is unique about this branch of psychology is that most psychology until that point focused on pathology or what was wrong with people. And positive psychology looks at what makes life worth living instead of just pulling up people to a level of normal functioning. And so it was intended to be complementary to traditional psychology, not to replace it in any way. Now, what is flow? Flow can be described as the process of optimal experience. Flow is widely researched in positive psychology. In fact, it is the most widely researched topic in positive psychology. And if you didn't already know, the person who invented positive psychology, Csikszentmihalyi, was also the founder of flow. So, what is flow? It's a highly enjoyable psychological state people experience where they act with total involvement in an activity. It's when you're completely immersed in an activity to the point of losing awareness of time, surroundings, and all other things except the activity itself. So how did flow come about? The initial study was done by Csikszentmihalyi, and it's really funny because I was watching a TED talk that Csikszentmihalyi did, and he said he usually starts a talk by explaining how to pronounce his name and then what it means. But he said that in TED Talks they only have 18 minutes, so he said usually it will just take up the whole 18 minutes, so I won't even try. And that was the one thing I had to practice the most for this presentation, was how to say his name. Csikszentmihalyi studied 200 artists, athletes, professional chess players, and musicians. All these participants excelled in their respective fields. They all spent a great deal of time and energy focusing on their careers and deriving joy from them. The participants were asked to describe their experience of engaging in the activity when the activity was going really well. His main finding was that across the widely diverse activities, there was a common experience in that the activities were autotelic in nature, which means they were rewarding in and of themselves. Later, this experience came to be known as flow. Now, there are 9 characteristics of the flow state of attention, and they are, let's go over them really briefly. The clear goals are defined for each step. Actions produce immediate, unambiguous feedback. A balance exists between perceived skills of an individual and perceived challenge of a situation. Action and awareness are merged. Concentration is on the task at hand, and no consciousness exists regarding distractions. There's a sense of control over oneself and the environment. Failure is not a concern. Self-consciousness disappears, and the sense of time becomes distorted. Also, activity becomes autotelic or enjoyable by nature. Now, there are certain conditions to be in the state of flow. One of the important ones is the point 3, which was there's a balance that exists between perceived skills of an individual and perceived challenge of a situation. And this is a condition in which flow will occur. So what this means is that when challenge is high and skills are low, you'll fall under the area of anxiety. Whereas if the perceived skills are high and the perceived challenge is low, then it leads to boredom. So what is necessary is to have that balance to be in that state of optimal experience, and it's called the flow channel. So for an example of this would be like if you started playing tennis or a new sport, and initially it would be, you'd probably be in anxiety because it's new and your skills are low and your perceived challenge is high. But then as you get better at it, and then say you're really good one day and you're playing with someone who's not as good, and then it's kind of boring. So there's some interesting examples of flow that I came across. Apparently, Michelangelo was in a state of flow when he painted the Sistine Chapel of the Vatican, and he didn't. And one of the things that happens in flow is that you even sort of you're not aware of your bodily needs. So he didn't eat or sleep for days, and he just painted till he passed out, and then he would wake up again and be completely absorbed until he finished the whole of the Sistine Chapel. Bruce Lee talks about flow in one of his books, and then it says you. So you're given like an understanding or like a brief understanding of what flow is. Do any of you feel like you've ever experienced this state? Yeah. And could you give me examples of like the settings in which you have?
Dancing. A walk in nature.
Drumming.
Sorry?
Painting.
Motorcycle.
Oh. Yeah, that's interesting. Writing? Climbing.
Reading.
Yeah, so it's interesting because there's really like a wide range of activities that you can experience this state. For me, it's usually writing and, usually presenting. So, I feel a little bold saying that right now, but.
You mean you feel bored?
So this is just a summary of when this concept originated was about 40 years ago when Mihai came up with it, and ever since then there are several of hundreds of articles written on flow, and I really think that it is one of a really in conventional psychology. I think it's a very very important and worthwhile contribution that he's made. And there's studies in like lots of sports journals and things about sports and athletes in flow and how that affects their performance. And then dance and flow, music and flow, and then lately in the past decade, a lot of interest in how flow improves performance in a corporate setting as well. Also in educational settings, so they look at flow in the teacher and how that affects like student learning, and then flow in the students and how that affects their performance. And then even in travel and tourism, and there are lots of cross-cultural studies done as well on flow. So there's a really vast body of literature out there. And why study this? Why study flow? So according to the research and studies, there are a lot of benefits to flow. Studies show that many of our social problems are due to a lack of flow in everyday life. Flow provides the opportunity for individuals to advance their optimal development. Flow activities help build self-confidence that allows an individual to grow, learn to develop skills, and contribute to society. Studies have found a correlation between flow experiences and quality of performance as well as quality of life. And people who report a high frequency of flow experiences are more satisfied with life in general. And flow enables one to have a more fulfilling life and to create a better future. So that's a pretty compelling argument right there of the benefits of flow. However, I think my own personal interest in this state of attention actually started when I came across Femi's work on his brain research on attention, in which he says that at any given point of time, human beings can be in one of four states of attention. The first one being narrow objective. Now this is when you're focusing on one stimulus or a few stimuli, generally to the exclusion of others. And this is, an example of this would be the state in which most people spend their jobs if they're not particularly passionate about their job, because you're focusing on one thing and you're not passionate about it. And it's also the state that causes the most physical and mental stress. The other state is narrow immersed, where again you're focusing on one or few stimuli, but you're completely immersed in it. So you would presumably you would be passionate about it, or there's some kind of investment in what you're doing. Example would be like a musician. The other state is diffused objective, which is when there are many stimuli, but there's a certain distance from them. You're not immersed in them. So an example of this would be driving, because like when you've been driving for a while, you don't really have to like narrowly focus on what you're doing. And if you're anything like me, you can probably brush your hair, do your makeup, and eat while driving.
Yeah.
So the fourth state is diffused immersed, which is when there are many stimuli, but you feel connected to them. And this is a relatively, people report this quite rarely, it's not as common as the others. It's a very interesting state, I think. And an example of this would be when you're on the beach looking at the ocean, or for some people in meditation, where they feel union with everything. So according to research, the narrow immersed and the diffused immersed are the most beneficial states of attention that you can choose to be in. And to me, it just seems like, wow, if everyone has a choice about what state of attention to spend their time in, and we're always in one of these states, then I just think more people should know about the choice. And also, it's quite sad that most people spend so much of their time in narrow objective, since it's the most stressful. And another feature of this state of attention is that you wouldn't be aware of how stressful it is. So that's my personal reason for why I study flow. And before that. So when I was doing all my research on flow, and I read some of Csikszentmihalyi's books, and when he talks about flow, and when he writes in his books, he he says that his aim is to help human beings control the contents of consciousness, because this is the way that that's the only real way to be happy. And he sort of says that the universe is hostile, and bad things will always happen, and so this is the only way that to really ensure your own happiness is that you control it in your own head. And for some reason, I just felt like looking up his background. And I did, and what is interesting is that, so there, as I said, several hundred studies done on flow in the way that was conceptualized by Csikszentmihalyi. And it was really hard for me to get a hold of his background. So when I did, finally, I found that, so he was born in Hungary. He was deeply affected by the Second World War. So when he was a child, he was put in Italian prison, and this was between the ages of 7 to 10. And it was here, in the prison, and he'd lost lots of his friends and family to war. And it was in prison that he first had the idea about flow, and he used to use chess as a way to enter a different state of consciousness, where, this is a quote from him directly, it says, "I discovered chess was a miraculous way of entering into a different world where all those things didn't matter. For ours, I just focused within a reality that had clear rules and goals." And he also used painting as a way to enter flow when he was upset about the reality of the situation. So, not to discount any of the work that he's done is great, but I think that it is important, and if there's one thing that I've learned at IPP, it's that to look at the epistemological relationship between a researcher and the topic that's researched. And I just found it interesting that this is what he came up with, and his concept is the same one that I'm looking at, but I'm just looking at it from a completely different lens. And his sort of life experience really tied in with his whole conceptualization of flow. So now I'm relating flow to something called self-expansiveness. What is self-expansiveness? Now, there have been many approaches to understanding the self concept. So what is the self? The main one that we deal with is the individualistic versus the social relational. So it's sort of like, especially when culture comes into it, it's, the boundary of the self for individualistic is, it excludes others, and then the boundary for the social relational, or collectivistic cultures mainly, includes others as a part of their self-concept. Now, Friedman came up with the term self-expansiveness. Self-expansiveness is an integrating framework that explains how the self-concept, which is typically identified with the narrow individualistic or the social relational, to a more expanded form of identification. So with the ecological, the temporal, and the transpersonal. And it provides a framework not only that resolves this individualistic and relational dichotomy, but also the disparate perspectives, because when you think of self, there's the biological, there's the body, there's the environment, there's temporal, there's like you have a timeline and this is who you are based on time and past and the past. So all these, like what he says in self-expansiveness is that all these are actually, they are all in relationship to one another. And so it is rather abstract in that it is just a framework, and this might be the reason that it's not a very well, it hasn't been very popular in the field of transpersonal psychology. There are very few articles on it, even though I think it's quite interesting. So how is self-expansiveness transpersonal? Well, first of all, he explains that there are two levels, actually three levels, of the individual, but I'll just be talking about the personal and the transpersonal. So he actually explicitly says that these are the levels of self-expansiveness. And this is where we get into the transpersonal, where essential to the concept of self-expansiveness is the assumption that there are no absolute limits as to what can or cannot be included as part of an individual's self-concept. This implies that identification with any and all aspects of existence is possible, and that literally everything that exists can potentially be seen as part of an individual's self-concept. And the self here is assumed to be unbounded. So the farther reaches of this boundary of the self-concept can be seen literally as transpersonal in the sense of going trans or beyond the personal or isolated sense of the prevailing Western notion of the individual self into a potential merger with all that is, a notion that approaches a spiritual understanding of human potential. And he also explains that transpersonal level of self-expansiveness as that it extends sufficiently beyond the here and now, such that there is a dissolution of the individual's perception of self as an isolated biosystem existing only in the present. The framework of self-expansiveness is broad enough to encompass disparate conventional approaches that define self-concept and also clearly moves beyond just these to include a transpersonal perspective. So flow and self-expansiveness. Most literature on flow deals with the social, personal, and cognitive, affective dimensions. And the limitation that I think exists in the literature is that they don't address anything beyond these dimensions. And as I said, that could possibly be because it was constructed from a certain epistemological position. So I think it might be beneficial to highlight the transpersonal dimensions of flow, specifically by relating it to self-expansiveness. The subjective experience of flow can be compared to self-expansiveness, and thereby can also be interpreted as a transpersonal phenomenon. So I have two themes that I use to relate flow and self-expansiveness. One is dissolving boundaries, and this is just a little bit of what's in the conventional research that